Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a distinct honour to rise in this House to speak on any issue for the riding I represent in Durham. But since the beginning of this year in January, it's also been my profound honour to rise in the House as Canada's Minister of Veterans Affairs. That's a huge responsibility for anyone to serve those who've served us, to serve the veteran and their family. It's a responsibility I take very seriously, and I appreciate the Prime Minister's confidence in me, Mr. Speaker. And it's very special to me as well, because I joined the Canadian Armed Forces at 18, spent 12 years serving Canada, the highest form of public service in a place full of public servants. The highest form of public service, and then when I left uniform, Mr. Speaker, like so many veterans I meet, shortly after hanging up my uniform, I tried to help out my comrades and support military families, veteran families, the best I could, including here in Parliament. So I want to thank the member from New Westminster, Coquitlam, for bringing this issue, the broader issue of our obligation to our veterans, to the floor of the House of Commons today. It's something that is not spoken about enough in this place. It's also good to see he's passionate on public policy items beyond shark fin soup, and this is a very substantive piece that I'm glad he's bringing. It
is always important to talk about the needs of our veterans here in the House of Commons. Over my 3 years here as a Member of Parliament, I have often spoken about our men and women in uniform in the Canadian Armed Forces and our veterans. As Members of Parliament, we must all work to ensure that we serve the needs of our veterans today and in future. This is our duty, Mr. Speaker.
Very proud, Mr. Speaker, to bring Bill C-58 to this House for consideration. Almost 7 weeks ago, if I recall correctly, that has a profound set of modernizations to the new Veterans Charter. This appears to be the first formal response from the opposition party, the New Democratic Party, to this substantive bill. I'm a little surprised it's taken them so long to comment substantively on this, but I'm glad it's here nonetheless. Our government inherited the new Veterans Charter, Mr. Speaker, introduced and brought forward by the last Liberal government, and then implemented by our government since 2006. Like any new substantive change to the delivery of benefits and programs, it needed updating, and there needed to be some gaps fixed. In 2011, our government proceeded to fix one of the larger gaps by creating the Permanent Impairment Allowance Supplement to support, in an additional capacity, our most seriously injured. And Bill C-58, Support for Our Veterans and Their Families Act, recognizes that there were also a number of key measures that needed to be addressed. That while the new Veterans Charter, all members of the House at that time in 2005 voted for it, is a very good approach to wellness, to transition, to support for veterans and their families. It did emerge, and several groups and the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs and others did note that there were critical gaps, as well as our Ombudsman, Guy Perron. So Bill C-58 is meant to address those gaps, Mr. Speaker. Cependant, il resterait de travail à faire.
However, work remains to be done and gaps remain to be filled as identified by the Ombudsman of our Canadian Armed Forces and many veterans groups, and by the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs.
On some of the gaps that had arisen and been recognized in the new Veterans Charter. So Bill C-58 is our attempt to get the balance right. And I thanked publicly the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs, as my friend from Guelph recently said, it is rare for an all-party committee of Parliament to agree on some recommendations. I want to thank them for that, and it was a brief glimmer of taking the politics out of this file, which I think we need to do more of. I'm hoping that over the course of this debate today, we can go back to that brief glimmer of moment and try and address substantively what is in Bill C-58, beyond just the motion about a covenant that the member brought today. I'm going to go through the substantive additions to
revoir
getting the new Veterans
les
Charter correct,
ajouts
Mr. Speaker.
majeurs
First, the
qu'on
most
a apportés
important, the item
à la
that the
charte.
Ombudsman, Guy
D'abord,
Parent, identified as the most critical item
le
that was
point
not
identifié
impacting
par
veterans
l'Ombudsman
now,
Guy
but was a
Parent,
real issue
qui
in the
n'a
future,
pas d'effet sur les
was
anciens combattants maintenant, mais
post-65 income for our moderately
mais-
to severely injured
qui en aura
service
un
members,
dans
Mr.
l'avenir.
Speaker.
Eh
We have
bien,
about
c'est
1,200
le
members,
revenu
men or women,
après
releasing
l'âge
each year
de
from the Canadian
65
Armed
ans,
Forces
où nous avons
because of a medical
1200
issue.
soldats qui
Those range-
sont libérés.
Or interrupt the minister for a moment. I understand there's some problem with the translation. I don't know if some of the switches are not turned on properly, but if the translation staff could sort that out, it would be greatly appreciated. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the job the translators do, and I've been trying to improve my French, so I appreciate them being patient with me in that progress. To start back, Mr. Speaker, the RISB, the Retirement Income Security Benefit, was a benefit we worked with all groups, including the Standing Committee, who identified that there was a gap at 65 for our moderately to severely injured. When the earnings loss benefit, an income supplement while they're transitioning, while they're retraining, and for many people that are on that to 65, when that ended, there was going to be a sharp decrease in their income, Mr. Speaker. That was an unintended gap, as I've described it, because the earnings loss benefit is meant as an income replacement while someone's doing job training or re-education. And post-65, it's more of a retirement issue. And for those, particularly those injured people who do not have pension time from their time serving with the Canadian Armed Forces, something needed to be done so that they did not have a steep drop-off, Mr. Speaker. So we introduced the Retirement Income Security Benefit, which means post-65, those veterans will be guaranteed a 70% level of income compared to the year previously at 64 from Veterans Affairs, Mr. Speaker. That provides certainty for the veteran and their family in their future, in their retirement years, the Retirement Income Security Benefit. It gives them that security, it gives them that peace of mind. Another thing it does, Mr. Speaker, that the old Pension Act did not do, is it has survivability to the spouse beyond 65. The exceptional incapacitation allowance did not have such survivability to a surviving spouse beyond 65, Mr. Speaker. So it's actually enhanced and better and addresses the gap identified by the Ombudsman a couple of years ago and again last year in the Standing Committee report. We also introduced the critical injury benefit, Mr. Speaker, which still is mischaracterized radically by people in this House, and I'd urge the honourable members to actually look into the details. This was not meant to be a benefit that applied to all 700,000 veterans in Canada. It was, again, another benefit earmarked for seriously injured, and in particular, it was going to address the circumstances that we all know of where there was a veteran critically hurt in Afghanistan, for instance. And in fact, I know the opposition members in the NDP know of a case that is similar to this, where someone went through a traumatic injury, hospitalizations, major surgeries, but because the disability award, the so-called lump sum, which is not the only thing seriously injured veterans get, by the way, Mr. Speaker, our friends still like to imply that it is, but because the disability award is assessed once they've recovered, you had people that went through traumatic injury, multiple operations, time in intensive care, but because they got better, they got a very low disability award, Mr. Speaker. This critical injury benefit recognizes and compensates the pain and suffering related to that trauma and the period of recovery. It was another gap, Mr. Speaker, that we've closed. We also introduced the Family Caregiver Relief Benefit, Mr. Speaker. Having worked very closely with military and veterans families since I left the military, long before I became a member of Parliament, we all know the incredible strain on the family that a serious injury causes. We need to do more, and our government has been doing more in recent years by expanding counseling for family members affected by post-traumatic stress or operational stress in the home. Most recently, we doubled that. We've allowed families to continue to access the important military family resource centers beyond after their family member leaves the military. And this caregiver relief benefit helps the most seriously injured, who in many cases will have contract care that Veterans Affairs pays for in their home. But we all know the spouse, partner, the adult child, it's a 24/7 job. And so this allows them some respite, up almost $8,000 tax-free a year, to be used where they can to get additional support, to fly in a family member so that they can recharge their battery, so they can help with their family life. Over time, Mr. Speaker, I see us doing even more, because the new Veterans Charter actually has programming for families, unlike the old Pension Act, which didn't really have programming and anticipate the wellness needs. We've also, Mr. Speaker, beyond C58, expanded the eligibility for hundreds of more veterans in the permanent impairment allowance category. PIA is a lifetime benefit, Mr. Speaker. I've also said that I want to wrap the PIA, the permanent impairment allowance, its supplement, and the retirement income security benefit into a lifetime pension for our most seriously injured, Mr. Speaker. That's where we're moving. I don't hear anything from the opposition after years of howling. We're making progress, and I don't see substantive questions on that front. I've also made sure that we show the respect our reserves deserve, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that Class A and Class B reservists have the same access to earnings loss benefit as Class C and regular force members will. So if you're injured serving your country, you will get that income replacement and vocational rehabilitation up to $75,000 per person, Mr. Speaker, if you're injured. I've also announced in recent weeks, Mr. Speaker, over 100 case managers that will be targeted to specific areas of need, Mr. Speaker, with flexibility built into the system, and at least 100 more combination of more benefit adjudicators to get through the backlog, Mr. Speaker. And we do have a backlog. The Auditor General recognized that, and we're acting. Critically, Mr. Speaker, what's in Bill C-58 that the honourable member who brought this motion seems to ignore is a purpose clause, Mr. Speaker. His motion today, talking about an obligation, is in many ways a purpose clause. We have a far superior and advanced clause in Bill C-58 that he apparently either doesn't know or glossed over, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I will read it to this House. The purpose of this Act is to recognize and fulfill the obligation of the people and Government of Canada to show just and due appreciation to members and veterans for their service to Canada. This obligation includes providing services, assistance, and compensation to members and veterans who have been injured or have died as a result of military service, and extends to their spouses or common law partners or survivors and orphans. This Act shall be liberally interpreted so that the recognized obligation may be fulfilled. Many of my colleagues, and I do consider my colleagues friends on this, Mr. Speaker, they talk sacred obligation, solemn obligation. The obligation is clearly written in C-58, Mr. Speaker, and in fact their motion doesn't even suggest that it should be liberally construed. So in fact, they have not even followed the guidance the Standing Committee offered last June, Mr. Speaker, when recommendation number 2 from the Standing Committee said that the provisions of this Act should be liberally construed and interpreted, and with respect to the recognized solemn obligation, Mr. Speaker. So in fact, I'm glad my friend brought this motion today, even though it's flawed and doesn't go as far as Bill C-58, Mr. Speaker. So I'm happy to say I'll be supporting my friend's motion today. And I actually urge him, and the government urges him, to dig a little deeper and to see that the purpose statement, the obligation spelled out in Bill C-58, goes much further, Mr. Speaker, and is actually, it accords with what the Standing Committee the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs recommended last June. His motion doesn't, Mr. Speaker. So this purpose clause came as a result of looking at what the Standing Committee produced. It came as a result of talking to veterans groups and veterans organizations. And that is what led to the Support for Veterans and Their Families Act, Mr. Speaker. I would also say, and at the outset I referred to this, my first day in this House as minister, I quoted Sir Robert Borden and the obligation that we owe since Borden's time in 1917 when he first articulated it to our veterans. I quoted Borden's line, which is actually, he termed it the just and due appreciation that we owe our veterans. In fact, we've used his language to show the connection from 1917 to today of this obligation. I have termed the obligation a tremendous obligation, Mr. Speaker. Whether we call it solemn, sacred, tremendous, it's enshrined in Bill C-58 that I hope the honourable member looks into further and gets behind and supports. I'm going to support what they're bringing to the floor, Mr. Speaker, today, but I'd ask that they go further and join us and pass C-58 quickly through this House. I have included it in the Budget Implementation Act in case the political gamesmanship continues on this file, Mr. Speaker, because I made a solemn, sacred pledge to our veterans to make sure that these reforms and these new benefits pass before July, Mr. Speaker, and they will. Important to note is from Borden's time to today, we have an obligation that is living. And the new Veterans Charter, the Veterans Charter is intended to be living, and Bill C-58 breathes new life and new reforms into the new Veterans Charter brought forward by the Liberals in 2005, implemented, updated in 2011, updated again before this House now. Veterans' care and benefits are not frozen in time, Mr. Speaker, to 1917. In fact, the Pension Act that emerged after World War I then led to the creation of Veterans Affairs Canada after World War II. So Borden's obligation predates my department, Mr. Speaker. That's how historic it is. But in Borden's time, there was very little done. In fact, a member of Borden's caucus, Mr. Speaker, Sam Sharp, the MP for Ontario North, died as a result of PTSD in World War I, Mr. Speaker, the only sitting MP re-elected to the House in World War I. Mental injuries from service were not even recognized back then, Mr. Speaker. We've come a long way, and that shows that the money we're committing and the programs we're delivering in mental health care shows that we have an evolving commitment to meet our needs for our veterans now and in the future. We're doing more for families, Mr. Speaker. We're doing more for mental health. We're doing more in terms of alternate therapies like equine therapy, like assistance dogs and service dogs, Mr. Speaker. Those were not programs delivered in the 1950s. We also have the VAC account. We're doing home visits. Those weren't conducted in Borden's time, Mr. Speaker. What we have to do when we talk about the obligation is it's a positive obligation upon the government to constantly ensure we're looking to the future to meet the needs, to meet the medical programming and benefits that veterans and their families and their children need, to recognize the obligation, but not to be frozen in the way it was delivered in 1917 or in 1950, Mr. Speaker. I think all members of this House know what progress we've made in many areas of physical and mental rehabilitation for our veterans and their families. We owe it to them to use the Veterans Charter, the new Veterans Charter, as a living document, to use the obligation that we're talking about today, the obligation enshrined in Bill C-58, which we've specifically said should be liberally construed, owing back to George Hees as minister in the 1980s, recommendation to give veterans the benefit of the doubt. I want to make that even easier, Mr. Speaker. Let's make it easier to get to yes for the veteran. Let's look at new programmings that will get them well, back to work, support their family members. That's what's in Bill C-58. So I truly hope, Mr. Speaker, that my friend, by raising the purpose provision of the bill, the obligation, which is very important, it's a principle, I truly hope the opposition members dig a little deeper and look at the benefits and programs and reforms we're actually rolling out to ensure that we meet that obligation, Mr. Speaker. Otherwise, it is just talk and posturing. And I'm going to constantly remind the opposition critic for the NDP, who I met when I was a young officer at a base in his riding. He's the only member of the Standing Committee that voted for the new Veterans Charter. He's had since 2006 to bring something like this to the House, but it's here 6 weeks after we introduced Bill C-58, the most substantive veterans legislation in a generation. Let's move past the politics, Mr. Speaker. Let's get behind C-58 and pass it.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for New Westminster Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for his comments and for his acknowledgement. And I also want to acknowledge his service to our country and the armed forces. I'd also like to thank him for his acknowledgement of my efforts on the work that I did trying to improve the health of our oceans. Unfortunately, when it came down to the vote on the importation of the shark fin to Canada, the ban, his party, members of his party, except 3, did not support that. That's very unfortunate. If 3 more had voted with the opposition, we would have had that passed. But unfortunately, that party voted against. But he raised the issue that they will be supporting this motion, which I think is very good news. Unfortunately, it's a long time coming. My honourable colleague from Sackville Eastern Shore has asked this minister and previous ministers this very question many times if the minister felt that there was an acknowledgement or an obligation, and he has failed to answer. So my question for the minister is, now that he is acknowledging this, what does that mean in terms of settling with Equitas and the class action lawsuit? If he could comment on that.
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague, but he's brought the House together today on a single issue, but by that question has shown he's actually not done the research. He's correct, Mr. Speaker. On my first day as minister, the honourable member from Sackville Eastern Shore did ask me about the obligation. I quoted Robert Borden, Mr. Speaker, and I called it a tremendous obligation that we owe our veterans. So I think it would be around January 23rd, Hansard. I would invite the member to check it out. Considering he's brought us all together to debate this today, I would have hoped he'd at least get my first statements on the obligation as Minister of Veterans Affairs correct. We have a tremendous obligation. The real question I would ask him, to ask his colleague from Sackville Eastern Shore, is why has it taken us since 2006 till today for him to bring this before the floor of the House of Commons, Mr. Speaker? Someone who likes to remind the House how many Ministers of Veterans Affairs he's faced off against. He's the only member of that committee that voted for the new Veterans Charter. He was on the old SCONVA committee, Mr. Speaker. There's nobody who knows this file more, and I would suggest nobody who's surfed this file from time to time more, Mr. Speaker. Our obligation statement in C-58 is closer to the ACFA recommendation that the member from Sackville Eastern Shore asked of this House last June. I'd ask him to check that out too.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member from Westmount Ville-Marie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I remember when I was at Staff College and they talked about what we now today know as PTSD in the First World War. They actually called it LMF, lack of moral fiber. And you could be taken out and shot because you had a lack of moral fiber. We have certainly come a long way since that time, and today I think we better recognize the fact that PTSD is not only an important consequence for some people from it, but it's actually quite common. Now, I commend the new Minister of Veterans Affairs for his commitment to our veterans. I think he still has a great deal to prove, but he's certainly a great improvement over his predecessor. However, I did hear him talk about cautioning the NDP about, to use his word, talk and posturing. We've had nothing but talk and posturing from the Conservative government over the last few years. So I want him to give me a warm feeling that he really understands PTSD and the urgent need to make sure that this is addressed by Veterans Affairs for our soldiers coming back from theatres of war.
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my friend for that sort of warm and fuzzy comment alongside a back of the hand as well. But I want to thank him for his service before his time in this House, both on the sea and in the air, in the upper air, actually, for Canada, and it's appreciated. No, he's absolutely right in terms of the lack of moral fiber, nervous shock, nervous breakdown. That's what Sam Sharp, my predecessor in this House 100 years ago, the Globe and Mail said he was returned from World War I after a nervous breakdown. Sadly, he leapt from the window of the Royal Victoria Hospital before returning to his riding, Mr. Speaker. We have come a long way, and I hosted the Sam Sharp breakfast last week with Romeo Dallaire, in part to show that we're making progress. We still have a way to go, a long way, Mr. Speaker. But if you look at our investments in recent years, we've gone from a couple of operational stress injury clinics to 26 by the end of this year. We're looking at alternative means of support because there is no one-size-fits-all solution for mental health, Mr. Speaker. And we're looking for support to the family. That was always the intention of the new Veterans Charter, to do more for families. He'd remember the old military expression from when the time we served in the Canadian Armed Forces. They used to say, if the military wanted you to have a family, they'd issue you one. Now we look at the family as being the core part of the unit for our military families and veterans. That's why his colleague from Markham Unionville launched us on the new Veterans Charter route, to have more support for the family and the veteran at transition. We will continue upon this path. I hope he recommends to his caucus and his leader to support unanimously Bill C-58 and our obligation statement in it.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague, the Minister, for his exceptional speech today, but also his exceptional work on the Veterans Affairs file and his leadership there. He mentioned, Mr. Speaker, a number of the benefits that have been increased under the Charter and under the initiative of this bill. One of the specific issues that our Finance Minister addressed in our recent budget was the whole issue of family caregivers, and I was pleased to see the extension of EI benefits to being made available to those who are caring for a gravely ill family member from 6 weeks to 26 weeks. That's an exceptional improvement. But I wonder if our Minister could outline some of the specific improvements that we made for the family caregiver aspect in terms of caring for our veterans and their families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my friend for that question and his passionate work on support for families with ill in their home, both young and old, and his work on palliative care. It's admired, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, we're very proud of the family caregiver relief benefit that is in Bill C-58. One of the reasons why I urge members of this House to pass it. We're providing more support for the families of our critically injured. The goal of the new Veterans Charter, and indeed Veterans Affairs in recent decades, is to provide the supports to keep the veteran in their home as long as possible. That's part of wellness, Mr. Speaker, to be with their family, to be with the people they know and trust in the environment they're comfortable with. So the Veterans Independence Program, all the way through to respite care being done by Veterans Affairs, focuses on keeping our ill, injured, or very elderly in their home. We're doing other provisions within our budget to apply that to more Canadians. But the Family Caregiver Relief Benefit will be a tax-free benefit of almost $8,000 a year that will give families that extra flexibility. We're also trying to make it as administratively simple as possible so that if that spouse needs to attend a child's graduation and they know there's somebody in the home that Veterans Affairs for caring for their loved one, but they're not there before 9 o'clock or not there in the evening, they need to fly their sister in or brother or to hire professional help to fill that gap. We want them to have that so that their wellness as the family caregiver for the support for that veteran is sound, so that they don't have caregiver fatigue, which we know happens, Mr. Speaker. So this is just one of many reforms we've had in recent years, providing more support in the home of the veteran, more support to families dealing with operational stress injuries in the home. Yet another reason for the opposition to vote in favor of C-58.
There's time for a short question if the Honourable Member from New Westminster Coquitlam can be brief.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister mentioned veterans that have taken their own lives, and many, as we know, veterans suffer from PTSD. And it's a very unfortunate statistic that there have been more suicides of Afghanistan vets than were actually killed in Afghanistan. So we all recognize the benefits that are needed for our soldiers. And my question is, will the Minister support separating C-51 from the budget omnibus bill.
Chair hopes the minister can be equally as brief.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly the focus of our Veterans Mental Wellness event last week, the Sam Sharp Breakfast, Mr. Speaker, focuses on telling the stories of some veterans who've become well after struggling with post-traumatic stress. As Romeo Dallaire likes to tell me, don't ever say you recover, because you learn to cope, you learn what programs work for you. So we need to tell more stories, because if anyone is out there struggling with mental injuries from service or with mental health, because men and women in uniform for Canada are just Canadians, so we will have mental health issues. They need to come forward because there's great new programs we've been investing in. They need to get behind that. That's why we've been enhancing these benefits, Mr. Speaker. Bill C-58 is yet another step in that road to enhancing care for our veterans.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my friend for his speech. Certainly there were eloquent and very respectable parts of that speech. His talk about Vimy was very engaging. Some of the political stunts in it were a little unfortunate because it detracted from some otherwise powerful statements. But he's focused a few times on closing the gap. And the interesting thing is, I know that member only joined this place in 2008, is what caused this gap, Mr. Speaker? What I would suggest that he should do as veterans critic for the third party is speak to the member from Markham Unionville. That member in the Liberal Party created the new Veterans Charter, Mr. Speaker. All members of this House at the time voted for it. He was not there, nor was I. But the gaps we're talking about, closing the gaps, are Liberal gaps, Mr. Speaker. He should do some research with the member from Markham Unionville. Now that said, let's take the politics out and say, what have we addressed from the Standing Committee's report? A vast majority of the moves have been made to fix those gaps that all parties agreed on. And in fact, today, the NDP motion doesn't even go as far as recommendation number 2 in that ACFA report. Our obligation statement in C-58 gets it done. Will he support C-58?
The Honourable Member for Guelph.
You know, until now, I wasn't very disappointed in the minister's approach to the file, but he's now suddenly disappointed me, and I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker. The new Veterans Charter was brought in 2005, and the then Liberal government never had an opportunity to deal with it because we lost the election. And it was this Conservative government that was given the mandate to implement it. And the new Veterans Charter in and of itself is a living, breathing document that would have met the needs of our veterans. But you know why it didn't? And I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker, because the Veterans Ombudsman said so. He said it needed to be adequately funded in total. Accessibility to the programs had to be available to our veterans. And the amounts of money they individually received had to be available by not making these thresholds of entitlement to the benefits so high. And you know what this government did with the Charter? They used it, not to the benefit of veterans, but to the benefit of this Conservative government in trying to balance its books. Had they properly implemented it, Mr. Speaker, our veterans would be better off today. Instead, we have a Prime Minister who, rather than adequately funding the new Veterans Charter, has chosen, for instance, to give $2 billion to 14% of Canada's most wealthy through income splitting. You know what Sir Robert Borden said? And I said it in my speech. He said it's our first duty, not our second duty, not our third duty, our first duty to meet the needs of our veterans, over and above the wealthy and those who will benefit from all the other programs the Conservatives have presented to make the wealthy wealthier. Thank you, Mr.